In this video, I'm going to talk about the changes I've made to last year's battery monitor box, which is this guy. I built this last year when I switched to a 12-volt lithium powered system. Lithium batteries have a very flat discharge curve and don't give you a good indication of their capacity if you just are looking at their voltage. So this box keeps track of the amount of current that's going out of the battery when I'm using it, and then also the amount of current going into the battery when I'm charging it. And then from that information is able to calculate a capacity and then also a time remaining given the amount of power I'm currently using. The box also has individual power switches for each of the main circuits, both 12 volt and 5 volt, and allows me to adjust those loads as I go along, and also each of those circuits has an individual fuse in case something does short out. Externally, the only thing that's different this year from last year is there's now a GPS antenna that mounts in the bow of the boat, fairly far from my body, so my body doesn't block a lot of the signal. And secondly, there's now a little pigtail with a micro USB connector on it that allows me to recharge my phone. And then it stores in this little orange little garage here that has a vertically sloped floor, so that water can't collect inside of there while it's raining, or from mist or splashes coming from waves that I impact with the boat. Everything else that's going on this year is changed internally, which is quite extensive. And the reason for that is that I'm fishing in Oregon's Silusla River in tidewater for salmon in the fall. And tidewater, or head of tide, is about 23 miles from the mouth of the river, and my dock is about 19 miles from the mouth of the river. And in the early fall, when the fish start showing up, they're of course at the mouth, and I've got to travel usually between 11 and 12 miles before I even start to troll for fish, and then I troll another 5 or 6 miles before I get to the mouth. So I've got to do long distances. My little torpedo motor, even though I carry 3 batteries, is pretty taxed going those distances. And the only way I'm able to do that is if I'm traveling with the tides coming and going. I can troll against tide because I'm not using much power for trolling, but for traveling I've got to be going with tides to get there in a reasonable amount of time and not use up all my energy storage. So last year the way I was managing this was between using information on my smartphone like time and tide tables, and doing mental calculations about where I would be given that sort of information, and also what speed I was going. And the torpedo was giving me speed information because it also has a built-in GPS system. Although it tends, because it's kind of buried inside of the battery boxes, that doesn't always hold the lock on the satellites, so I do lose speed information every once in a while. Whereas this guy, being totally exposed and also being an active antenna, is so far yet to ever lose a lock in the times I've been using it. So what I've done with the new improved version is calculate all those things I was doing in my head and looking up on the phone inside the box, and specifically using the GPS to figure out exactly where I am in terms of river miles on the river, and then for that information being able to calculate how long it's going to take me to get from like point A to point B, tell me what the state of the tide is at any spot along the river. One of the biggies is that it allows me to calculate where I will be when the tide change hits me, and I need to turn around. So that was probably one of the most important things I've got now, and so now I know exactly where I'll be and whether I need to make any changes based on that information before I get there. So the rest of this video is going to be about the individual things, both the hardware changes I've made and then kind of an overview of the different features that are available in the software now for calculating what's going on. Last year's design used a Arduino Uno as a processing board, and that worked out great for the capability that I needed for the previous year. My design of a daughter card used all the I/O pins on the Uno except for two and the majority of the code space. So clearly any additional hardware or software is going to need an expansion. And so I went from the Uno to the Mega 2560, which has many more I/O pins and 256K of flash memory for program storage. At this point I'm using about 70K of program storage in the Mega, and nowhere near any capacity in the I/O pins. So that was the first change that was required. Fortunately, the Uno and Mega have majority of their pinouts in common, obviously excluding the additional pins that Mega has. So there was only a few pins that I had to move on my daughter board to switch from one to the other. So once I got the daughter board modified to attach to a Mega, then it was just a fairly simple matter to add an expansion board, an additional daughter board to contain two off-the-shelf little PC cards, one which has a real-time clock chip on it and a battery, and the other one that has the GPS chip on it. And those were just soldered onto the daughter card. You notice the GPS chip has a antenna connector on it. It can run without an external antenna, but since I have this board buried deep inside of the box, there was no way I was going to get a GPS signal into there. The real-time clock uses a DS3231 chip, which has a temperature compensated oscillator and keeps very accurate time, so you shouldn't need to set it more than once a year, even if that often. Also on that module is a battery that I use for keeping the clock alive when the power's off, and then I also rewired the module to bring that battery voltage out, and I have it wired into the GPS module to keep its internal operations alive also when the power is turned off, specifically its internal clock, and also its ephemeral table about where the satellites were last seen. I use the real-time clock for a couple things. The most obvious is just time of day on the display, but more importantly I use it to keep statistics on the batteries and the things I'm doing out in the river. I have set up a couple internal calendars on the EEPROM memory in which I store operating times on a daily basis. I store the minimum battery voltage that occurs on a daily basis. I also keep track of number of charge cycles on each battery. And by each battery I mean I can switch between two different batteries, and each contains its own set of statistics that are kept independently. One of the things I also do is that when the battery is turned off, I keep track of that time between when it was turned off and when it's turned back on again, and then calculate the amount of charge loss that occurred while the battery is turned off, and that goes into the counting of how much charge is left on the battery. Then in the next photo you can see the insides of the box with the computer modules in the upper right corner, and then the other odds and ends. It's gotten pretty cramped in there, but still workable as long as I do things in the proper order. Also new this year was a relay that I've added into the charging circuit. The charger I'm using, after it's through charging, runs a test on the battery, which puts a load on the battery and discharges it some over a 24-hour period, which is something I do not want to do. I want to, once it's through charging, I want the entire charge available to me. So I added this relay in the charging circuit that once my software detects that the charger is complete, it disconnects the charger from the battery. Compared to this hardware, the software was a much bigger effort. The original system had no menu system for selecting different operating modes, so that was the first thing that had to be designed. The box only has a single up-down switch for doing input, so the menu system had to conform with that two-position switch. And basically, I use one switch direction to cycle through the menus, and the other switch direction to select a menu item. There are two major menus at the top level: one for the normal operation mode called Run Mode, and then a second for the charging mode. Within the Run Mode menu is a sub-menu called Utilities, where less frequently used options or setup options are located. I'm not going to go through all these items. If you want to read through them, you can pause the video and you can peruse at your leisure. I will talk about some of the major displays and modes. The first being battery status, which was what was available to me last year with the addition of a time. So you can see there's time and temperature, there's the battery voltage, there's the capacity of the battery, so it's 43% is remaining in capacity. And at the current power usage of 1.3 watts, which is what just the Arduino draws, there's 49 hours of capacity left. So that's again what I had available last year. For this year, I've got with the GPS, the first one here is time to location. Location here is a waypoint that, or a destination that I've entered into the computer. I have a whole set of landmarks that I used to keep on my smartphone, and would have a mileage, a river mile associated with it. And now I can select from that list on the computer, and in this case, on the second line, you're seeing I'm traveling from my current location, which is my dock at 0 miles, and traveling to the Tierman boat ramp, which is 4.4 miles away. And it tells me at my current speed of 5.5 miles per hour, I'm headed downriver, and it will take 52 minutes to get there. The next example is tide at location, and this is basically a tide table for the position I'm currently at on the river. So it's using my GPS position and then calculating the tide based on the reference tide at the mouth of the river. And in this case, it shows you that the upcoming tide is a low tide. It's going to be 1.1 feet, and it'll occur at 2:34 a.m. It's already 42% into the low tide, and the magnitude of this tide versus the largest tide we ever see during the year is 50%. So it's kind of an average tide, and it'll take 4 hours and 6 minutes until the tide reaches this point. The next display is the kind of the heart of the whole system, which is location at tide, which is where I calculate where I will be when I intersect the next tide change. And on this display you can see it's showing me my speed, that in fact I'm headed downriver, and that intersection will occur in 3 hours and 43 minutes. And I'm currently at mile 0.1, which is basically my dock, and the intersection will occur at river mile 11.2. And in my case, I'm using river miles with respect to my dock, not to the mouth of the river, mainly because I'd already learned these miles in my head when I was doing this manually, and it was a lot easier to keep using that same system than to convert to river miles based on the mouth, which is what's normally done. So the heart of all this is using the GPS information to then convert that into a river mile that says where I am on the river. And I do that by having a database of points on the river that are about 1,000 feet apart, except in corners where they're closer together, and then figuring which two points in this database I'm between, and then calculating the distance between them, and then also calculating the offset, assuming these were east-west points above and below, to get an accurate fix. The Saluso River is primarily an east-west river, so most of the time I can just use longitudes to figure out where I am, but near the mouth and near the end of tide, it does go north-south, so then I have to I switch modes. Most of the time I can use just a single latitude or a single longitude to figure out what between two reference points I am. So once I know where I am, then I can using the tide table information, calculate this location, which basically boils down to a two-train leaving the station problem, one train being me and the other train being the tide leaving the tide station. So that all worked out pretty well, and actually it works quite quickly and smoothly. I could actually, all these calculations I'm doing without using any trig functions, so it goes quite quickly. And then finally, the thing that I added last was the night navigation mode. And originally that wasn't in my plans, and then I realized that, gee, that's one thing I was still doing with the smartphone, was pulling it out to navigate at night, especially when it was foggy. And so I came up with this, since I already had all the information I needed from doing the other tide location and location at tide, that I could do this navigation operation fairly quickly. So I've got two screens I'm going to show you. One is where I'm on the center line of the river, and so that little rectangle with a line through the center is my icon for within the center line zone. In addition to that, I've got some information that I'd find useful at night, particularly the time, the speed, which is 3.5 miles per hour, what river mile I'm at, the time to whatever location I've entered in, which is the hour and 13 minutes, and then the 1.5Q is the GPS horizontal precision, which is a quality factor and tells you how reliable the GPS information is. If it's below 2, it's real good data. If it's below 1, it's extremely good data. And if you're getting above 5, you really shouldn't trust that kind of data, which means you shouldn't trust what the centerline graphic's telling you. And then the final piece of information is the when twilight begins, or first light. And I have it programmed to be when first light that's usable for me to fish by. And then the second display, you see there's a lot crammed in there. And then in the second display is where I'm off the center line. And so if I'm to the left of the center line, I eliminate the Q number that was there. If I'm to the right of center line, I eliminate the twilight information. So now I'm left of center line. The vertical bar by the rectangle is where the boat is. And each pixel is equivalent to 3 feet away, so there's all the pixels between that rectangular box and the 2 after the hour and 12 minutes. That center line can move across there, so it's there are about 30 pixels on either side of the center line, so basically 90 feet one side or the other that can be displayed on this display. I'll stop here. I think you've got a good idea of what I've tried to accomplish with my little onboard computer. I'm going to start fishing here in a couple days, and it'll be interesting to see how these features that I've added play out in actual use.